assassin John Hinckley. Only a quick dash to the hospital saved his life. Just 4 weeks later,
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
He addressed Congress. He was more popular than ever, and what became known as the Reagan Revolution was underway. While cutting taxes, the Reagans themselves spent lavishly to restore an aura of glamour and glitz to the White House. Breaking with the past, President Reagan nominated the first woman to the United States Supreme Court. He dealt a devastating blow to union labor when he broke the air controllers' strike by setting a deadline, then firing them all.
And if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
In world affairs, he launched a huge U.S. military buildup. He rejected détente with the Soviet Union, which he called an evil empire.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
To the dismay of the Soviets and many who described themselves as peace lovers in America, Reagan proposed his Star Wars scheme, a multi-billion-dollar effort which he called a defensive shield against nuclear weapons in space. It wasn't until his second term that he met with the Soviet leader, but in 1985 he and Mikhail Gorbachev began a partnership that culminated in the first arms treaty to actually reduce the number of nuclear weapons. And a few years later, when communism began to crumble, many gave credit to long-standing policies accelerated by President Reagan.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Elsewhere, his foreign policy was dogged with confusion and tragedy. He sent U.S. troops to Lebanon, only to withdraw them after 241 American servicemen died in an Iranian-sponsored suicide bombing. Still, he was praised for his warmth and dignity as he comforted the servicemen's families.
I never took a penny that didn't belong to me.
Later, he was embarrassed by a national security aide, Oliver North, and others, who admitted secretly trading arms to Iran, diverting the proceeds via Swiss banks to Nicaraguan Contras, and lying to Congress to cover it all up. Investigators said President Reagan approved at least some of these secret dealings, but he pleaded ignorance.
I did not know what had happened or whether there had been a diversion or any money to divert.
What became known as the Iran-Contra scandal tarnished his second term, but did not destroy his popularity. Riding horseback and doing chores on his ranch, he kept his all-American image intact, and his optimism never flagged.
My fellow citizens, our nation is poised for greatness. We must do what we know is right and do it with all our might. Let history say of us, these were golden years when the American Revolution was reborn, when freedom gained new life and America reached for her best.
Ronald Reagan left office with the economy booming. A recession was right around the corner, but as he left, the economy was up, the deficit was soaring, and his public approval rating was higher than any other modern president. He retired to California, where he dedicated his presidential library along with 4 other living presidents. A firm believer in happy endings, his own last scenes were touched by sadness. In 1994, he revealed he was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. He wrote a farewell letter to the American people saying, "I now begin the journey that will take me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead." For those of you who may be joining us in progress, President Ronald Reagan has died. The cheerful crusader who devoted his presidency to winning the Cold War, trying to scale back what he saw as a government far too big, and making people believe it was morning again in America. He died today after a long twilight struggle with Alzheimer's disease. A family friend said that he died peacefully this afternoon. He was 93 years old. He died at home in California. The White House was told that his health had taken a turn for the worse over the last several days. President Bush was alerted today. President Bush is in France for the commemoration of D-Day, and no doubt we'll be hearing from the president sometime as the day goes along, President Bush. 5 years after leaving office, the nation's 40th president told the world in November of 1994 that he had been diagnosed with the early stages of Alzheimer's, an incurable disease that destroys brain cells. The president said he had begun quote, the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. And today, that sunset came. We go down to Los Angeles, California, and CBS News correspondent Jerry Bowen. Jerry?
Well, Dan, reporters began their vigil at the Reagan home in Bel Air this morning as the word leaked out and finally the confirmation came that the president's health was failing and that this afternoon he had died. With him was his wife, Nancy, and two of their three children. He was 93, as you mentioned. He'd been suffering from Alzheimer's for nearly a decade. And because of that disease, he was denied the retirement that he had envisioned. Days spent with his close circle of friends were in the wild, wide-open spaces of the ranch that he had near Santa Barbara, California. It was the West, as Mr. Reagan knew it, that helped shape his vision of America, a land where he believed the American dream was possible for anyone who worked hard enough to get it. After all, he'd come from humble beginnings to become the most powerful man on earth. And when he left that office, he headed home.
January 20th, 1989, Inauguration Day. Ronald Reagan was suddenly a former president making the long cross-country flight back to California, back to the state where he'd forged his political career.
Will there be an adjustment period for you and for Mrs. Reagan?
I haven't even thought about anything of that kind. I don't use the word retirement. I think there are a lot of things yet to be done.
You wouldn't go back to the movies. I mean, even certainly in a cameo role. I mean,
there's a kind of a lingering feeling that would look a little bit like kind of cash in on this job that I've had.
The homecoming would prove bittersweet. There was a problem that first year back, the nagging perception the Reagans were cashing in on their Washington years.
Ron and Nancy are home!
Their California retirement home, a $2.5 million hilltop ranch house in exclusive Bel Air, was a gift from 20 wealthy friends. The Reagans paid them back, but the appearance of impropriety lingered.
I've been out of work for 6 months, and maybe there's a future here.
As the former sportscaster joked about his job prospects at the 1989 All-Star Game, he was already well into a lucrative public speaking career, $50,000 per appearance. But it was a trip to Japan in October of 1989 that provoked the most stinging comments. For 2 20-minute speeches and a few public appearances, Mr. Reagan was paid $2 million by a Japanese conglomerate.
We're allies, but we're more than allies. We're friends.
Back home, Mr. Reagan could not escape a hangover from his administration, the Iran-Contra scandal. Aides were being tried for the illegal scheme to sell weapons to Iran and give the profits to Nicaraguan guerrillas. As president, he denied approving it. In a deposition for one trial, the former president had trouble remembering details.
You were not aware and did not learn of North's activities in supplying the Contras with military aid. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not sure I'm understanding this.
Years later, there was speculation this courtroom appearance revealed signs of the disease that would eventually rob him of his memory. But he continued to lead a very public life, including the 1991 dedication of his presidential library in Simi Valley, California. It was an historic occasion. For the first time, 5 U.S. presidents were brought together. And for one more time, the president revered as the great communicator shared his view of the world.
The Iron Curtain has rusted away. Totalitarianism is melting like snow.
Mr. Reagan spent as much time as he could at his ranch near Santa Barbara, hosting dignitaries he'd first met on the world stage. The ranch was still Reagan's great escape. But he could not escape what was happening to him. Slowly, perceptibly, he was undergoing a wrenching change. These were among his last public appearances. His 1994 birthday celebration. The funeral of Richard Nixon that same year. The year Mr. Reagan made a stunning admission in a handwritten letter to the American people. He'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life, he wrote. I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead.
Happy birthday, Mr. President.
As Mr. Reagan began his involuntary retreat from the public eye, his daughter Maureen became an outspoken advocate for Alzheimer's research.
But it is an equal opportunity disease, and it doesn't make special arrangements for former presidents or first ladies.
And Nancy Reagan, who had protected her husband and his image throughout their long marriage, became his voice and his ambassador.
And I'd like to propose a toast to my fella.
She went alone to his birthday celebrations and the commissioning of the USS Ronald Reagan. She mourned alone at the funeral of his daughter Maureen. The former president, remembered by millions, had become a man with no memories of his own, unable to share the major moments of his own life. Back in 1989,
I think there are a lot of things yet to be done.
On that cross-country plane trip the day he left office, the former president had mused about going home.
California isn't a place in my mind, it's a way of life.
His idea of the California dream, a dream that faded all too quickly beyond sunset into darkness.
Mr. Reagan's body will be moved to a mortuary near his home and then will be taken to the Reagan Library probably tomorrow in Simi Valley, the Hilltop Library, where the public may come to pay its respects. Then the body will be flown to Washington to lie in state in the Capitol. The funeral service will be in the National Cathedral. Mr. Reagan will make his final journey to California to be buried on that hilltop overlooking the West. Dan?
Jerry Bowen reporting from Los Angeles. Ronald Reagan, dead at age 93. Jerry, just before you go to do some more reporting, has there been an announcement about the official cause of death? We know the president was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. He'd had a bout with a colon polyp in his medical history. Any official notification about the cause of death?
There has been no official word on the exact cause of death. We do know that the nature of this disease is that eventually it shuts the body down.
Thanks, Jerry. As Jerry Bowen has pointed out, there'll be about a 4-day period now of mourning for President Reagan and funeral services. As mentioned, there'll be one in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and the president, of course, will be buried in California. Ronald Reagan was elected president for the first time at age 69. He was the oldest man ever elected to that office. He maintained a sunny atmosphere. It was one of the keys to his having 2 full terms in the presidency, a kind of thumbs-up demeanor. Despite several bouts of illnesses during and after his presidency, and of course, who can forget that just after his election in 1980, the president was the target of assassins' bullets. He barely survived, was very nearly killed. He'd had his difficulties over the years, but as it turned out, he's lived longer than any other president of the United States, dead today at age 93. CBS News Chief White House Correspondent John Roberts is traveling with the presidential party of President George W. Bush in France, where this weekend was set aside for the commemoration of D-Day, the invasion that resulted in the freeing of Europe from Nazi tyranny. And John joins us live now from France. John?
Good evening to you, Dan, and certainly the news of President Reagan's death is going to overshadow the D-Day ceremonies that were planned for tomorrow morning. There was to be, and will still be, a bilateral ceremony tomorrow morning with President Bush and French President Jacques Chirac, but certainly, Dan, at this point, everyone's thoughts are going to be turning to the 40th President of the United States. It had been rumored for some time that President Reagan was on a downhill cycle, that he had been sick with Alzheimer's disease for a decade. Typically, people who develop Alzheimer's disease, reaching back to my hat as a medical correspondent, Dan, become bedridden. And the big danger with people who are in bed for an awfully long period of time is that they finally develop pneumonia and pass on. Word that President Reagan was becoming gravely ill has been circulating for some time. We do know that the family has been making ongoing funeral arrangements. Obviously, it would be a very large ceremony, and there's a lot of logistics to plan. So they have been making those plans to get a lot of dignitaries, probably the President of the United States out there to California for the funeral. Of course, there would be the lying in state as well in the Capitol Rotunda to take care of. So we do know that there have been these ongoing plans. Word, though, that President Reagan was near the end came earlier today when President Bush was traveling on his way from Rome, where he had been meeting with Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi here to France. A White House spokesman came back and said that a family source had said that the president was near the end. Then we learned that at 4:10 Eastern Time this afternoon, Ronald Reagan's former Chief of Staff, Fred Ryan, called Chief of Staff for President Bush, Andrew Card, and said Ronald Reagan had passed on. Dan?
John Roberts reporting live from Normandy. We go down to Paris, and CBS News correspondent Bill Plant. Bill Plant covered Ronald Reagan for many years. He's one of the most knowledgeable people in the country about Ronald Reagan and his presidency. Bill, if you're there, let's review what Ronald Reagan always considered to be his major accomplishments as president.
Dan, Ronald Reagan was a guy who came to government to shrink it. He wanted less government, but the face that he presented to the public didn't appear to be that of a cost cutter or a radical conservative. It was a friendly face. And he succeeded beyond conservatives' wildest dreams in shrinking the size of government, partly by spending so much that there was no money left. He enjoyed defying expectations, Dan. They used to say in California when he was governor, with Ronald Reagan, what you see is what you get. He was willing to negotiate. He was not a hard ideologue. And he always had, as I'm sure you've already noted, that sunny optimism, which looked forward, never back. He had other people to do all his worrying and all his score settling for him. He never troubled himself with that. And in that sense, he was an amazingly unpolitical politician. He had political instincts. He knew how to deal with people, but he didn't have the average politician's need to be loved. He didn't need the adulation that most politicians do. He was, I guess, satisfied from a lifelong, for acting all of those years. He was a guy who was very sure of himself, didn't need the kind of public reassurance that so many other public figures do. And that's one of the things that served him so well, Dan.
Bill Plant reporting live from Paris. Bill Plant, who covered Ronald Reagan's ascendancy to the presidency and then covered him in the White House during his presidency for the full 8 years of that presidency. Thanks, Bill Plant. We go now via telephone to Edmund Morris, one of the many biographers of President Reagan. Are you there, Mr. Morris?
Yes, Mr. Rather, I am.
Well, tell us what you think are the most important things to know as we look back on the Reagan presidency and mourn the death of this truly extraordinary man who was elected to 2 full terms of the presidency, elected by an absolute landslide for his second term.
Well, I feel that a large part of the earth has crumbled away. There was something epic about Reagan and his sheer historic size, which was why he was such a controversial figure as governor and through most of his 2 terms as president. But in retrospect, he's loomed larger and larger, in my opinion. And the fact that he so solidly stood at the end of the last century makes him seem, from our point of view now at the beginning of this one, to have been one of the most substantial presidents of that century. In my opinion, the greatest since Harry Truman.
We're speaking live now with Edmund Morris by telephone, remembering Ronald Reagan, who died today at the age of 93. Mr. Morris, historians, I hesitate to say play these games, but they rate presidents. And correct me if I'm wrong, there's been for a long while a consensus that the 2 most effective, the 2 greatest American presidents were the father of the country, George Washington, and the man who saved the Union, Abraham Lincoln. And then different historians will differ about how the rankings go below that. As we talk today, on the day that President Ronald Reagan has died, where does he fit in the pantheon of American presidents? And over the next 25, 50, 100 years, all we can do is speculate. Where do you think he's going to be rated?
I don't like to speculate about things like that. It's too soon. But I will say that a measure of the largeness of Ronald Reagan is the things around us that we no longer see because of his presidency. For example, where is Soviet communism? Where is the Berlin Wall? Where is national malaise? Where is double-digit inflation? Where is our contempt for and our embarrassment about the American military? These and many other positive achievements of Ronald Reagan, we now feel simply by their absence. It's what we no longer see in the world that testifies to the way he changed things.
In writing your biography of Ronald Reagan, you spent a lot of time with him. And we all know that Ronald Reagan was a great storyteller. He was a great narrator. What's your own favorite story from Ronald Reagan's collection?
There's quite a few I wouldn't want to repeat on the air. Well, I'll tell you something that touched me very much when I was talking to him once in the Oval Office. I asked him if he wasn't sort of wistful about his lost theatrical and cinematic career. And I said, don't you ever have a hankering to get back on the stage? And he looked really surprised by the question. He said, whoa, no. Why should I? I have the biggest stage in the world right here.
Edmund Morris, biographer of Ronald Reagan, who died today at the age of 93. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Morris.
Thank you.
For President Ronald Reagan, politics was a second career, as Edmund Morris just pointed out, and as everyone of memory age during the Reagan years knows. The future president honed his communication skills as a Hollywood actor. CBS's John Blackstone looks back now at the life of Ronald Reagan, Act One.
Good evening, everybody. This is Andy McKean with some hot news right off the griddle.
Ronald Reagan wasn't headed for Hollywood when he headed west in 1937, and it wasn't for the movies. It was for radio.
Here are the Chicago Cubs and Avalon.
Sent by his Iowa radio station to cover the Chicago Cubs spring training on Catalina Island. But a friend introduced him to an agent who got him a screen test, which won him a meeting at Warner Brothers with Jack Warner himself.
An agent called him and said, there's a chap out here from Des Moines, Iowa, who, as I understood him to say, he was a sports radio announcer in Des Moines. His name is Ronald Reagan. I said, fine, bring him over and let me say hello to him.
What was it, Mr. Warner, that caught your eye when you looked at that first test of Reagan?
Well, he had his personality projected in what we, as I term it, off the screen into the audience. It come through. He had a good smile, happy delivery.
Hello, Holly. Want to hear some good news?
That film persona, the good-looking, all-American, easygoing guy, fit him like a glove. And he fit right in at the film factory, eventually churning out more than 50 pictures, 8 in 1938 alone.
Then where are we, my friend?
High and dry. That's the last drink.
Reagan called himself the Errol Flynn of the B movies. But the truth is, he mostly didn't get the girl.
Yeah, it's Judy. You know, Doc, I've loved her for a long time, but I can't help her now because, well, you're the one man, so be nice to her, will you?
But he did get a wife.
Just something I forgot to do in the rose garden.
His first, Jane Wyman. And he did play bit parts in A movies with the biggest stars of the day, movie after movie, year after year. Regarded not as a star, but steady. His career got a big boost from a supporting role. Football legend George Gipp in Newt Rockney, All-American.
Rock. Someday when the team...
Well, we'll play the rest of that at some future time during our coverage of what transpires over the next 3 or 4 days with President Ronald Reagan dead at age of 93. But that gave you some sense of Act One of Ronald Reagan, the man in development, the man who developed into a two-term and very popular American president. One of the things that's often said about President Reagan is that he had perhaps the best personality, the sunniest personality of any American president. Some would argue that Theodore Roosevelt also had a sunny personality, but however one rates it, President Reagan had that sunny smile, great optimism, forward-looking, never seemed to meet a stranger, didn't seem to carry a grudge, was slow, almost impossible to anger. And there's a long list of accomplishments during his presidency. One cannot speak for him, of course, but having spoken to him some over the years, read a good deal about him, I think it's fair to say that among the things that President Reagan would like to have pointed out about his 2 terms as president during the 1980s is, number one, his absolutely unrelenting determination to defeat communism as it was personified in the Soviet Union. And number two, that he did indeed shrink the size of the government, instituted what we now call deregulation on a wide and deep scale. Number three, that he presided over a consensus for the shoring up of defense of the United States, that Ronald Reagan was a believer that the military during his time needed to be revitalized and rebuilt, and indeed he did that during his presidency. Now, details and timing of President Reagan's funeral have not yet been officially announced, but it is expected that he will first lie in repose at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California, and then later in the rotunda of the United States Capitol before his state funeral at the National Cathedral. President Reagan is to be buried on the grounds of the Reagan Library in California. There'll, of course, be more about this on your local news on this CBS station, on the CBS Saturday News, and there will be a special program on CBS later this evening during prime time as we reflect upon and mourn the presidency of Ronald Reagan and his death this afternoon at age 93. For the moment, I'm Dan Rather in New York. Now we return you to CBS Sports and live coverage of golf.